Here is something nobody tells you about investing in your child's dream. The moment you sign that check, you stop being their parent. You become their banker, and bankers apparently don't get invited to grand openings. Let me tell you all about my experience. Welcome back to Dad's Pure Emotions. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Edward Hastings. I am 63 years old, retired from 31 years in commercial real estate, and I like to think I have seen every variation of human deception this world has to offer. I have sat across negotiating tables from men who smiled while they robbed you. I have shaken hands with people whose grip was warm and whose intentions were frozen solid. I thought after 3 decades of that, nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. And the person who proved me wrong was a 56 woman in a cashmere sweater who called me Dad at Thanksgiving and asked for the salt like she was already planning what to do with my money. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stay with me. It started as most disasters do, with a dream that sounded completely reasonable. My son Nathan came to me on a Sunday afternoon in March. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, Margaret beside me drying her hands on a dish towel, and he laid out this business plan like he was presenting to the board of a Fortune 500 company. Craft brewery, Pacific Northwest style, tap room, small batch production, local distribution. He had folders, projections, a logo, for heaven's sake. I looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at me. Nathan leaned forward and said, Dad, I've been researching this for 2 years. This isn't a whim. This is a real business. I picked up one of the folders and flipped through it slowly. I said, Where did you get these projections? Nathan said, Vanessa helped me put them together. She has a background in finance. You know that. Not a word, just a sound. The kind of sound a woman makes when she's being polite, but her entire soul is screaming. I had been married to her for 38 years. I spoke that language fluently. I looked at the logo on the front of the folder. It said Hastings & Co. Brewing. I will admit something moved in my chest when I saw that. My name, my son's ambition. 31 years of work potentially building into something that would outlast me. I said, How much? Then I said, I'll think about it. Now, what I did not tell Nathan that afternoon, what I did not tell anyone, was that I had already started thinking about it 3 weeks earlier. Because 3 weeks earlier, Margaret had said something to me that I could not unhear. We had been at Nathan and Vanessa's house for dinner, candles on the table, the whole performance. When Nathan stepped out for a phone call, Vanessa smiled at me and said, Edward, Nathan talks about you constantly. He really wants to make you proud. She tilted her head. This brewery is going to change everything for us, for the whole family. I said, It's a big investment. She held my gaze a half second too long and said, You won't regret it. On the drive home, Margaret was quiet for 10 minutes. Then she said, She already knows the number. I said, What number? Margaret said, The investment number. Nathan hasn't asked you yet, but she already knows what she's asking for. I could see it, the way she was watching you. I filed it, right next to the candles and the smile that lasted too long. I called Carl Hammond on a Tuesday morning in April. Carl and I went to Ohio State together. He is the only man I know who finds tax fraud genuinely entertaining. He answered on the second ring. I said, Carl, I need a favor. He sighed. Go ahead. I told him about the brewery, about Nathan, about Vanessa, about Margaret's instinct and the half-second smile. Carl listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him. When I finished, he said, You want me to look at the business plan? Everything is a big word, Edward. I said, I know what I'm paying you for. He laughed. Give me 2 weeks. I gave Carl his 2 weeks, and in the meantime I played my role perfectly. I called Nathan and told him I was in. I watched him go quiet on the phone, that particular silence of a man who cannot believe something he wanted is actually happening. He said, Dad, really? I said, It's a good plan, son. I believe in you. What I did not say was, I believe in you completely. It's someone else I'm not so sure about. Margaret was standing in the doorway when I hung up. She said, You're not transferring the money yet, are you? I said, Of course not. She said, good, and went back to her book. 38 years and she still trusted my instincts even when I hadn't fully explained them. Carl called me on a Thursday evening. I knew from his tone in the first 2 seconds that he had found something. He said, "Edward, you're going to want to sit down." I said, "I'm already sitting." He said, "Sit better." I pulled my chair closer to the desk. I said, "Talk to me." Carl said, "That business plan your daughter-in-law put together, beautiful document, professional, clean projections, solid market research, reasonable timelines." He paused. "Completely disconnected from the actual financial structure she filed with the county." The room got very still. I said, "Say that again." Carl said, "The business plan she gave your son is a showpiece. What she actually registered, the LLC structure, the operational accounts, the vendor contracts, tells a completely different story. There's a second account, Edward. Operational expenses are being routed through a holding company that has nothing to do with the brewery." I said, "Whose holding company?" Carl went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Fellow by the name of Marcus Vale." I sat back in my chair. I closed my eyes and I thought about Vanessa at that dinner table. Candles flickering, lamb on the plate, telling me I wouldn't regret it. I said, "Carl, how long have they been setting this up?" He said, "From what I can tell, before Nathan ever walked into your kitchen with those folders." I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. The house was quiet. Margaret was upstairs. The clock on the wall ticked the way it always does, patient, indifferent, keeping time whether you wanted to or not. I thought about my son. I thought about the way his voice cracked slightly when I told him I believed in him. And then I picked up the phone and called Frank Doyle. Frank answered in that slow, deliberate way of his, like every word costs him something and he's decided you're worth it. He said, "Edward, it's been a while." I said, "Frank, I need to set up an escrow account and I need it done quietly." A pause. Then Frank said, "I'll have the paperwork ready by Monday." I hung up. I looked at the clock. I smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because the game had changed, and only one of us knew it yet. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. Let me tell you something about being deliberately excluded. It is not the exclusion itself that hurts. It is the performance that surrounds it. The careful construction of reasons, the cheerful tone of voice, the way people look at you like you are supposed to smile and accept it and ask no questions. I have never been good at that last part. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Margaret came to find me in my study. I was reading, or pretending to. Mostly I was thinking about Carl's phone call and the name Marcus Vale, and the way a person could build a trap with folders and projections, and a logo with your family name on it. Margaret stood in the doorway and said, "Vanessa called." I looked up. I said, "And," she said, "the brewery opened." I put my book down very slowly. I said, "When?" Margaret said, 10 days ago. The room was quiet. I let that number sit in the air between us. 10 days, not a phone call, not a text message. Not even a photograph sent casually the way people do when they want to seem like they remembered you as an afterthought. Nothing. I said, "What exactly did she say?" Margaret sat down across from me. She folded her hands in her lap the way she does when she is controlling something. Anger, I suspected, though with Margaret it always comes out looking like composure. She said, and I am quoting directly here, so don't look at me like that, "It was 10 days ago. We only invited close family and friends. It was very intimate, very low-key." I looked at my wife. My wife looked at me. I said, "Close family and friends." Margaret said, "That's what she said." I said, "We are his parents." Margaret said, "I'm aware of that, Edward." I leaned back in my chair. I thought about the word intimate. I thought about $480,000. I thought about how intimate is a very interesting word to use when you were describing an event that was funded almost entirely by someone you chose not to invite. Then I smiled. Margaret watched me smile and said, "Why are you smiling? I need you to explain the smile because from where I'm sitting there is nothing remotely amusing about any of this." I said, "I'm smiling because she called." Margaret said, "She called to tell us we weren't invited." I said. No, she called to check on me. There's a difference. Margaret stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, Frank, I said, everything is exactly where it needs to be. She nodded once, stood up, smoothed her blouse and walked back out of the room like a woman who had decided to trust her husband one more time and was reserving the right to say, I told you so, if it went sideways. 3 days passed. I went about my life with the particular calmness of a man who is waiting for something he has already prepared for. I had breakfast. I read the paper. I called Carl twice to confirm the details he had sent me. Both times he answered with the enthusiasm of a man who was genuinely enjoying himself, which for Carl meant he said things like, "This gets more interesting every day," in the same tone most people use to discuss the weather. On the third day, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Vanessa. I let it ring twice, not because I wasn't ready, but because I believe in the power of making people wait exactly long enough to feel it. Then I answered. I said, Vanessa, what a nice surprise. Her voice came through warm and slightly breathless, the way it always was when she was performing urgency without wanting to seem panicked. She said, Edward, hi, I'm so glad you picked up. How are you? How's Margaret? I said, we're wonderful, just enjoying the week. Quiet around here. She laughed, that light practiced laugh. She said, that sounds so nice. Listen, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I said, you're not. Take all the time you need. A tiny pause. Then she continued, so we've been getting the brewery fully operational, and you know how it is with new businesses. The first few weeks are there's so much coming at you at once. Vendors, staffing, permits. I said, sounds exciting. She said, it really is. Nathan is in his element. It's wonderful to watch. Another small pause, shorter this time. So, the thing is, Edward, some of the initial bills are coming due. Operational setup costs, some equipment balances, just the natural cash flow of a new launch, and we were expecting the investment transfer to have cleared by now. I just wanted to touch base and make sure everything was still on track on your end. Silence, I let it stretch. 1 second, 2, 3. She said, Edward. I said, I'm here. She said, with just the faintest tremor of impatience underneath the warmth, did you get a chance to transfer the money? And I smiled. Not the polite smile I use at dinner parties, not the professional smile from 30 years of closing deals. The real one, the one Margaret says makes me look like I know something the rest of the room doesn't. I said, of course. It was handled weeks ago. Now that silence told me everything I needed to know and confirmed everything Carl had already found. A legitimate daughter-in-law would have exhaled and said, oh, wonderful, must be a processing delay, I'll check with our bank. Instead, the silence lasted 4 full seconds. I counted. Then carefully, handled how? I said, transferred as agreed, every dollar. She said, to the account. I said, to the account set up for this purpose. Another pause, tighter this time. Which account specifically? I want our bookkeeper looking in the right place. I said, Frank Doyle has all the details. He handled the transfer on my behalf. You remember Frank, give him a call. He's been expecting to hear from someone. The temperature of the conversation changed. Something shifted the way air shifts before a storm. For one unguarded moment, Vanessa stopped performing. Who is Frank Doyle? And there it was. A legitimate daughter-in-law would have said, great, I'll call him, what's his number? Not, who is Frank Doyle? In a voice gone 2 degrees colder than it was 60 seconds earlier. I said pleasantly, he's my attorney, 20 years, slow talker but thorough. You'll like him. She recovered quickly, I'll give her that. Of course, yes, I'll reach out. Do you have a number? I said, tell him Edward sent you. We said our goodbyes with all the warmth of a business transaction disguised as a family conversation. When I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen where Margaret was making coffee and I said, she called. Margaret said without turning around, I know, I could tell by your walk. I said, she's going to call Frank within the hour. Margaret poured 2 cups and handed me one. She said, and what is Frank going to tell her? I said, exactly what I told him to. Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug and said, and Nathan, when does Nathan find out? I looked out the kitchen window at the yard. The oak tree we planted the year Nathan was born was thick and solid now, roots deep, branches wide. I had watched that tree for 31 years. I said, soon, but not from Vanessa, and not before we know exactly how deep this goes. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly, he's going to be devastated. I said, I know that too. We stood there in the kitchen, coffee warm in our hands, the oak tree standing in the yard, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, that some discoveries cannot be unfound, and some loyalties once tested reveal exactly what they were made of all along. My phone buzzed an hour and 17 minutes later. It was Frank. I answered and said, that was fast. Frank, in his slow and deliberate way, said, she called, asked about the account. I told her the funds had been secured in escrow pending verification of the operational structure. I said, how did she take that? Frank paused in that way of his, like he is choosing each word from a very specific shelf. Then he said, she asked what verification meant. I told her it meant we needed to confirm that the registered business accounts matched the investment agreement. She asked how long that would take. Another pause. I told her it depended entirely on how cooperative the documentation process was. I said, and, Frank said, she hung up before I finished the sentence. I set my coffee down on the counter. I said, Frank, it's time to make the call to Carl. Frank said, already ahead of you. He sent the filing documents an hour ago. A long pause. Then slowly, like a man savoring the weight of what he's about to say, Frank added, Edward, there's something else. I said, tell me. He said, Marcus Vale, he's not just Vanessa's cousin. He filed paperwork in 2 other counties, 2 other businesses, 2 other investors. The kitchen was very quiet. I said, this isn't the first time. Frank said, no, Edward, it is not. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that call. The oak tree, the yard, 31 years of watching something grow. And somewhere across town in a brewery with my family's name above the door, a woman was making phone calls she thought I didn't know about, to a man I now knew more about than she realized. The smile came back, the real one. Because the thing about being a banker instead of a parent, sometimes being the banker is exactly the right position to be in. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you for real. There is a particular kind of morning that exists only in the weeks before something enormous happens. The sky looks the same. The coffee tastes the same. The birds outside do whatever birds do, completely indifferent to the fact that somewhere nearby, a carefully constructed lie is about to meet the person who built the trap it walked into. I have always loved those mornings. It was a Friday. Margaret was at the table when I came downstairs. She had her reading glasses on and her coffee in front of her, and she looked up at me the way she has looked up at me for 38 years, like she already knows what I'm about to say and is simply waiting for me to say it. I said, today. She took her glasses off, set them on the table, said, Nathan too. I said, Nathan first. She nodded, stood up, refilled her coffee, and said with the quiet devastation of a mother who loves her son completely, make sure he hears it from you gently, Edward. Whatever she did, he still loves her. That part is real, even if nothing else was. I looked at my wife and thought, not for the first time, that the smartest decision I ever made in my life was asking her to marry me in a parking lot outside of Denny's in Columbus, Ohio, in 1986, with $17 in my wallet and nothing to offer but my word. I said, I'll be gentle, she said. You're going to want to be, because the moment he finds out, the gentle part becomes your job and the fury becomes his, and you need him clear-headed for what comes next. I called Nathan at 9:00 in the morning. He answered on the first ring the way young men answer when they're busy and distracted and running on the energy of something new. He said, Dad, hey, good timing actually. We just got the tap system fully calibrated. You should come see it sometime. It's incredible. I said, Nathan, I need you to come over. Something in my voice stopped him. I know this because the background noise of the brewery, the clinking, the movement, the low hum of machinery, all of it went quiet, like he had stepped into a separate room. He said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "Mom is fine. Everyone is fine, but I need you to come over and I need you to come alone." A pause, then carefully, "How alone?" I said, "Don't tell Vanessa you're coming." The silence that followed was the longest one we had shared since the day I told him his grandfather had passed. He said, "Dad, what's going on?" I said, "Come over, son. I'll explain everything." He arrived 40 minutes later. He came through the front door and into the kitchen, looking exactly like what he was. A 34-year-old man who had driven across town with a knot in his stomach he didn't have a name for yet. Margaret hugged him first, held on a beat longer than usual. Nathan let her, which told me the knot had already started to tighten. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had laid out his folders and projections 14 months ago. I sat across from him. Margaret stayed nearby but gave us the room. I did not ease into it. Easing into devastating news only prolongs confusion and shortens the part where a person can actually think. So I laid Carl's folder on the table, clean, organized, numbered. I said, before I transferred a single dollar of that investment, I had someone look at everything. Nathan didn't touch it. "What kind of someone?" I said. "Carl Hammond, my college roommate, forensic accountant." His jaw moved slightly. "You had the business plan audited." I said, "I had everything audited." Something moved across his face. Not anger yet. The particular expression of a person realizing two conversations had been happening simultaneously, and he'd only been present in one. He said quietly, "What did he find?" I walked him through it. The shell company, the routing of operational funds through Marcus Vale's holding company, the discrepancy between the plan Vanessa showed Nathan and the structure she'd actually filed, the two other counties, the two other investors, a pattern older than their marriage. I spoke slowly. I did not editorialize. I let the documents tell the truth without emotion, sometimes the only way truth can be heard. When I finished, Nathan sat very still. He did not cry. He did not shout. He stared at the folder for a long moment, then said in a voice that was almost too controlled, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough to protect the money. Not long enough to protect you from this conversation. I'm sorry about that." He said, "The investment, the 480. I said, "In escrow, Frank Doyle's office. Every dollar, it never went anywhere. Vanessa could never reach it." Something crossed his face, relief and grief arriving together, one of the cruelest combinations a person can experience. He put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. "She told me you'd transferred it weeks ago. She showed me a confirmation." I said, "I know," he said. "She fabricated a transfer confirmation." I said, "Carl believes so. Frank is working with that assumption." Nathan pushed back from the table, stood, and walked to the window, looking out at the oak tree. I let him have that. After a long moment, still facing away, he said, "Marcus Vale." I said, "Her cousin." He said, "I've met him. 4 times he came to the brewery to look at the equipment. I thought he was just—" He stopped, shoulders rising and falling. I introduced myself. He shook my hand. The room was very quiet. Then, still at the window, "Was any of it real, Dad? Did she ever—" He stopped, started over. "Was the brewery real at least, or was that just the mechanism?" That was the question I had been dreading, because the answer was complicated in the way only true things can be. I said, "The brewery is real. The building is leased, the equipment exists, the permits are valid. What wasn't real was where the money went after it arrived. The plan was to run the brewery long enough to justify the investment, extract as much as possible through the operational accounts. Then, Carl believes, manufacture a collapse, bankruptcy, clean exit." Nathan turned around, eyes dry, but his face looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 40 minutes. "And then what? They just disappear." I said, "There's a property. Frank found it. Coastal, listed under a holding company tied back to Marcus Vale." He stared at me. "She was going to take my father's money and buy a house." I said, "That appears to be the intention." He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands and stayed like that a while. I did not fill the silence. Margaret appeared in the doorway. I gave her the smallest nod. She came and sat beside him and put her hand on his back and said nothing. After a while he lifted his head. His eyes were red, but his voice was steadier than I expected. What happens next? What happened next took 11 days. Frank filed the documentation with the county. Carl's report went to 2 investigators who had, it turned out, been building a separate case on Marcus Vale for 18 months and were very interested in what we had. Vanessa received formal notice from Frank's office Tuesday morning. She called Frank 4 times that day. He returned none of those calls until he was ready, then spoke slowly and thoroughly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Marcus Vale was arrested Thursday. Vanessa retained a lawyer by Friday. Saturday morning my phone rang. Vanessa, I answered. Her voice was different, the warmth gone, the performance gone. What remained was something rarer, and I thought more honest, than anything she'd offered in 2 years of Sunday dinners and cashmere sweaters. She said, "You knew from the beginning." I said, "Not from the beginning, but early enough." A long pause. "The escrow account." Another pause. "You were never going to just wire the money." I said, "No." She said, "Why didn't you just confront us?" I thought about Nathan at the window, Margaret's hand on his back, 2 other investors in 2 other counties who hadn't had a Carl or a Frank, or a wife who noticed a half-second smile. I said, "Because saying something would have protected my money. What I did protects the people who come after you." A long silence. Then very quietly, "He didn't know, Edward. Nathan didn't know any of it." I said, "I know that. He's my son. I know exactly what he is." She had nothing after that. The call ended. Nathan filed for divorce 8 weeks later. It was not easy. None of it was easy. He came to dinner on Thursday nights, and sometimes he talked and sometimes he just sat with us and ate and let the house be what it had always been, a place where nothing was required of him except to show up. The brewery, as it turned out, was viable, genuinely viable. Stripped of the financial architecture Vanessa had built around it and restructured with Frank's guidance and Carl's oversight, it had good bones, good location, good product. On a Tuesday in October, on a morning when the sky was doing that particular autumn thing where everything looks cleaner than it has any right to, Nathan called me. He said, "Dad, I want to show you something." I drove across town. I parked in front of a building with a sign above the door. The sign said Hastings & Co. Brewing. Nathan was standing outside waiting for me. He looked like himself again, not the version from the kitchen table, the earlier version, the one with the folders and the projections and the logo. He said, "I know it's not how we planned it. I know a lot happened," but he stopped, looked up at the sign. "It's still real. It was always going to be real." I stood beside my son on the sidewalk and looked at our name above the door. I said, "Show me the tap system." He laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from him in months. He said, "It's incredible, Dad. I told you." I said, "You did." He held the door open and I walked in. The brewery smelled like grain and wood and something new, the kind of new that has been earned. I looked around the room, the long bar, the high ceilings, the light coming through the windows, and I thought about 14 months of patience. About a forensic accountant who finds fraud genuinely entertaining, about a lawyer who speaks slowly on purpose, about a woman who noticed a half-second smile at a dinner table and trusted her instincts enough to say something. And I thought about the fact that I almost signed that check on a Sunday afternoon, without a second thought, because it had my family's name on the logo and my son's hope in his eyes. And sometimes love makes you want to skip the part where you pay attention. Almost. I sat down at the bar. Nathan poured 2 glasses and set one in front of me. He raised his, "To the brewery." I picked up my glass, looked at my son, looked at the room, and said, "To paying attention." We drank. Outside through the window, the October light did what October light always does. It made everything look like it had already survived something, because it had. If you like this story, Join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.